Welcome back, honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of the exploration period and the growth of the Dutch East India Company and stuff like that, right? So the big thing about it is yes, I'm whispering, and yes, this is a little weird and stuff like that. But the problem is that my wife is currently on a series of calls in the next room, so I can't actually yell and shout during this flip. So I have to actually reuse an old one and stuff like that, just so I can be nice to her because she's got to meet with her clients and stuff like that all day. Okay. So the big thing about it is I'm about to clip in this other flip real quick, but I just wanted to say real fast that I think you guys are doing absolutely amazing. Huge shout out to all of y'all. Keep crushing it. I'm so proud. I was bragging on y'all to several other teachers yesterday, so keep up the good work. I'll see y'all soon. Watch this flip. Bang it out. I'll see y'all in class.
Left off in class where we were talking about the expansion of European powers trying to infiltrate that spice market that was going down in India, right? So let's not dawdle. Let's just get right into it, right? The Dutch in India, right? Well, technically, they weren't really in India per se. They were actually in that area known as the East Indies, right? Like places that you would in the modern day area call Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the islands that are actually north of what is now modern day Australia, right? Now, the thing about it though is the Dutch are going to go to that area and successfully infiltrate that spice market by creating a refueling port in Cape Town, South Africa, right? Right down there in the Cape of Good Hope, they're going to create their own colony to create a halfway marker between the Netherlands and the East Indies, right? Now, when they do this, they create a foothold in the area, of course, that is now known as the modern day South Africa, in the country of South Africa. The thing about it, though, is once they create that foothold, they can then catapult themselves into the Indian Ocean and infiltrate that spice market. Now, something that we need to understand about the effects of the Dutch and the Portuguese, if you talk to a person who's pretty well versed in Dutch history, they will actually tell you that the Portuguese were much kinder to the people of India than the Dutch were to the people of places like Java, for example. Like, the Dutch really came in, y'all, and like militarily suppressed and took over areas and like killed people and like took their land from them and then created these new spice plantations, right? Which is a really, really disgusting thing, which actually their government has recently apologized for to the areas of New Guinea and then other areas as well in what is now modern day Indonesia, Malaysia, and Southeast Asia. Now, the thing about it is like they need to, because it was really, really disgusting what they did. And they did all of this in the pursuit of money, right? They did all this in the pursuit of the creation of international capitalism, which is not going to be something that was intentionally created. It's just going to kind of grow out of the things that the Dutch actually created. So they are going to reinvent economics, and they are going to make more money than you could ever possibly fathom, right? And they do this by creating a joint stock company, the very first of its kind, right? Now, when we look at Portugal, right, like, so we actually can see that, like, the royals of Portugal invested their funds and actually made it, like, invested in the creation of naval fleets and shipping, like, industries and things like that. But at the time, y'all, monarchs weren't that powerful. And they also weren't that lucrative, right? They didn't have that much money. And a lot of that has to do with, like, bad infrastructure, technological woes, things that kind of stood in their way when it came to creating tax codes and also collecting taxes in a really efficient manner. I love you too, buddy. I know you're sweepy and you want to sweep with me. Now, the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at this, you have to understand there were limitations on monarchies, right? They had only so much money. Well, the Netherlands, now being a free country ever since they started their 80 years war against the Spanish, they're actually going to start creating this concept. Instead of using just one thing's money, right, the monarchy in this sense, they're going to create a joint investment company, okay? They're going to go up to people like, not just me investing in this company, I'm going to go up to Pierre here, and he's got boats. I'm going to borrow some of those, right? And he's going to invest in the company in that manner. My dog Josie's got a couple of boats. She's going to throw a couple of boats in there as well. And so the interesting thing is we are collecting investment from multiple different sources, right? And since we're doing this, we're actually growing our investment, and every time we make money, we then reinvest it back into the company. Y'all, that is the creation of international capitalism, right? The idea of reinvesting your profits to grow your profits again later on. So they reinvented economics by creating these joint stock companies and gathering investors from all over different areas of the Netherlands, and also some of them even outside of the Netherlands as well. And the company that they created was known as the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, which actually in Dutch means the Dutch East India Company, right? And that right there is their logo. They actually had a brand, right? Like they had a brand. Like when you think of Nike, you think the check. When you think of Lululemon, you think of that Omega symbol, right? When you think of Maria, what's another good logo that everybody knows? Apple. Apple's a good one, right? When you think of Apple computers, you think of the apple with a bite taken out of it, right?
Hold on, I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Drawing a blank. Come on now. You're better than this.
How about canes? I think of the dog.
She said canes. She thinks of the dog. All right, fine, we'll do that. All right, so she's a very dog person. All right, so like now, well, the big thing about it though is why was it called a brand name? Because literally, the products that are being traded from this company, the Dutch East India Company, would be marked with a brand. Right? They would heat up a very, very hot piece of iron that actually had this symbol on it: the V, the O, and the C. Why is this the V, the O, and the C, the brand name of the Dutch East India Company? Well, remember the name that y'all just wrote down: the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. Right? Like, so like the collectivized letters of that company, and they would sear this into the barrels or into the casks or into the actual boxes that they were using to trade all of their products, right? Hence why it's called a brand name or a branding onto those products, right? And the thing that y'all got to understand though is that this is going to create effectively the stock market, right? Because as the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie or the Dutch East India Company continues to grow, this will effectively create the stock market. Because let's say necessarily we want to keep expanding, not everybody's got a boat to contribute, right? Not everybody has that much money, but we can sell shares of this company, right? We can sell bits and pieces of this company to where those shares become more valuable as the company makes money. You then sell that share to another consumer and you keep the profit, right? Or you can even sell it back to the company, right? There's always a buyer for your stocks, whether you like it or not, right? This is going to create the birth of international capitalism and is going to make more money than you could ever even possibly fathom, right? So it's something that you need to understand when we're looking at like history's largest companies, right? You got a bunch of big ones, right? We just talked about Apple. You got Microsoft, who's actually made more money than Apple in the long run because they had a little bit more of a head start. Remember I told y'all in class, right, that Apple stock was like 25 cents whenever I was in high school because they were a terrible company at the time, right? So like then you got like Standard Oil and some of the other big companies throughout history, right? In the trillions of dollars, all right? So now look, this is how much money, though, the Dutch East India Company is worth. They are considered the most money-making company in history by far, valued at around $7.9 trillion. All right, so like now, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, being worth $7.9 trillion, is the equivalent of these modern 20 companies combined, right? Including Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, like Berkshire Hathaway, which is a real estate company, Samsung, AT&T, McDonald's, Netflix. You combine all them together, and you still wouldn't even get to the Dutch East India Company without the inclusion of many others, right? So that's how much money they are going to make creating the stock market and creating international capitalism, right? Now, the rise of the companies, though, is going to be really, really important because they're not going to be the only ones that do this. Because remember, we said this in class, nothing stays sacred for long, right? When somebody starts seeing the Dutch do this, they're going to copy it, right? They're going to copy it and they're going to make their own versions of those companies, right? Now, the big one, okay, they weren't the only one to ever do this. The next big one that's going to show up, though, is the British East India Company that a lot of people who are really religious, or not religious, who are really ardent history nerds are going to like Google this and then find my YouTube video and then go into the comments and be like, actually, Mr. Terry, if you look at the events of the actual creation of international capitalism, the British East India Company was created 2 years before the Dutch East India Company. You're right, but the British East India Company struggled mightily for many years to get their feet on the ground, whereas the Dutch one catapulted into the stratosphere of the the creation of joint stock companies. So yes, was the British East India Company started first? Yes. But did it not actually get nearly as successful as the Dutch one until a little bit later? Yes, so take that, nerd. Now, so the big thing about that you need to understand, though, is the British East India Company is going to be created as well, which is going to struggle a little bit at first, but they are then going to catapult themselves forward when the monarchy begins to invest in them, right? Now, Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth the First, right? The last Tudor monarch that we talked about, the second daughter of Henry VIII, sister to Mary and Edward, right? The thing that we need to understand about her, though, is she didn't even have enough money to start colonies, right? She didn't have enough money to start, like, kind of buying up things. She didn't have enough money to create a shipping business outside of the British Navy that she had to focus on, right? So she actually granted the company, the British East India Company, these things known as monopolies, right? She granted them monopolies on goods coming from certain areas of the world, right? Now, what is a monopoly, though, okay? A monopoly is not just this guy, right? A monopoly is actually far beyond the board game. It is the concept that a company controls the market in a good, right? Like that if you are going to buy Indian spices, you could only buy them in Britain from the East India Company, right? If you're going to buy tea, you could only buy it from the East India Company. If you were going to buy cotton, you could only buy it from the East India Company. Now, the interesting thing about monopolies means that that one company will make all of the money off of this product, but it also violates some interesting things about capitalism in essence, because it gets rid of competition, right? So the East India Company can now charge whatever they feel like for these products, whatever they so choose, right? So they're going to be making a catastrophic amount of money on things like tobacco, timber, and things like that are also going to be coming from North America following Columbus stumbling upon North and South America 500 years after the Vikings do under Leif Erikson. Now, what we need to get into, though, is that the creation of those monopolies and the investment of Elizabeth in them, she actually bought shares in the East India Company, right? She was like, I don't have enough money to start a colony, but they do, so I'm going to buy some shares in the company itself. She actually was one of their principal investors, right? So the interesting thing about it, though, is that these monopolies will create a catastrophic amount of money for the East India Company, as well as the Dutch East India Company. But the thing about it that you need to understand, though, is that the money gained from these monopolies will lead to war later on, right? Because there are going to be some wars between the Dutch and the English called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. There was actually going to be 3 of them, right? 4 of them if you count the later one that happened in the 1700s, right? So that's actually why if you ever look at like the colonization map of the New World, the quote-unquote New World of North America, New York's original name was New Amsterdam, because actually the British are going to claim it from the Dutch when they win a very large war against them, right? So more on that later, though, about how international capitalism and international consumerism will actually lead to war. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, though, right? We're not going to worry about getting deaded out in that right now. So going into it, though, now we're going to kind of put a pause on like all the stuff that's going on in Asia, right? The creation of these like different East India companies and the creation of these spice trade markets in Asia, and we're going to come back to them a little bit later on when we begin to talk about the thing like European takeovers, dominance, and imperialism later on, and the atrocities committed in these places, right? So now we're going to get into the atrocities committed in the Americas, right? We're going to start talking about North and South America and their involvement in this storyline during the Age of Discovery, or European exploration from the 1500s forward, right? Now, in the Americas, though, where we last left off is that Columbus has stumbled upon something, right? He was, of course, trying to find a route to get to India by going west and popping up on the other side of the world, but then he ran into 2 very large continents, right? The effects of Columbus's voyage and of European contact cannot be understated, right? Because where we left off, he is now actually landed in the Bahamas or the Caribbean. Now, something that's important to throw out there for the rest of your existence, Columbus never once set foot in what is now the modern-day United States of America. Never actually stepped foot in Florida, never stepped foot in what is now Louisiana or anywhere on the Gulf Coast. Never did, he didn't found, the Plymouth colony, which some kids for some reason believe. He wasn't on the Mayflower. Completely different thing, right? Now, the thing that we need to understand, though, is when this contact is going to be made, he's going to be doing most of his work for Spain's crown in the Caribbean. Now, remember, he is an Italian sailor, but he sailed for Spain, of course, and in the Caribbean, when he landed in the Bahamas, he's going to actually come into the contact with the natives that live there, right? Now, this contact is almost immediate from when he actually docks his boats, okay, his 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and then eventually, or almost immediately, the natives try to come up and actually communicate with him, right? And they were extremely peaceful, actually. The Taino natives is what they're actually referred to, the Taino people, greeted Columbus with open arms, right? They wanted to trade, they wanted to communicate, they wanted to figure out who is this person that's like rolling up on boats that we could never build this large, that are bigger than any home that we own. Who are these people? We want to learn from them, right? Well, the initial thing that's going to happen, though, is that Columbus tries to communicate with them, right? But then the relationship soon goes downhill after some long bouts of trying to interpret each other's language and things like that. They go downhill, though, when the Taino people, like many of the natives, that is going to be a common theme here, okay? When Columbus tries to introduce them to Christianity. Because, of course, he can't just, be chill about this. He's got to try and, convert them to Christianity, right? Because as you can see in this engraving right here, this ominous cross in the background is a little bit of a concerning factor, right? The relationship goes downhill, though, when he tries to introduce Christianity to them. But these people don't have a written language. They don't understand the concept of Christianity. They have their own religion already. And so trying to get them to kind of undo hundreds of years of culture and tradition is going to be pretty difficult. And they're going to be like, no, that's not really what we want to do right now. We'd like to trade with you and figure out how you have all this stuff that we don't have and all these different technologies that we don't have, right? But when those relationship goes downhill, it begins a disgusting tirade of violence by Columbus and his colonizers, right? Now, there's an interesting little interaction that happened here as well. After they began to refuse Christianity, Columbus also began to notice this jewelry that the Taino people were wearing, right? Now, this right here is some of the only surviving jewelry we have, archaeologically speaking, of the Taino people, and you'll notice that that is made out of rocks and stones. Well, some of the higher-ranking individuals in the Taino culture and society were always wearing gold jewelry, right? Jewelry that was actually had gold on top of it, on the inside of it, and surrounding it, right? And Columbus would actually, after long bouts of trying to learn their language, asked some of the Taino people, where did you get that from? And they were like, well, we have a little bit of gold here, but there's a lot of it over there on the mainland, right? Referring to what is now modern-day Mexico. Now, the really terrifying thing about this, y'all, is I want you to think about what kind of idea this put into the mind of the Spanish colonizers, right? That there is gold there, one, and that there is even more that is going to be coming later on, right? And so we have zero archaeological evidence of, like, gold jewelry from the Taino people left anymore because Columbus and, of course, the conquistadors took all of it, right? Columbus and his colonists are going to use violence to then force the Taino to retrieve gold, and they're also even going to bring some of them back as slaves to the actual rules. I kid you not when I say this. When Columbus came back from his first voyage from the Caribbean to go back and talk to Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain about what he had found and the things that he had discovered in these new areas, he brought back human beings with him. He brought natives back as slaves to give to Isabella and Ferdinand, all right? He then also, like, told his brother, who was in charge of the colonists that were being left behind in the Caribbean islands, in places like Puerto Rico and modern-day Cuba, where the Taino people lived, that they were allowed to use violence to force the Taino people to go out and retrieve gold, right? So there are stories about how apparently they would be giving a hawk's bell, like a bell, like a ding, 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 like a bell you would shake like this. Well, the handle would be broken off, and the bell would be handed to the Taino people. And the conquistadors told them, you have 3 months to fill this with gold, and if you don't, we're going to cut one of your hands off, right? So they would also apparently feed, like, children to Spanish war dogs. There are, like documented atrocities of, like, people being hung and then roasted over fires and stuff like that to try and encourage them to go off and find gold, right? And apparently, Columbus did such a bad job. This is really important that y'all know this because he's not that nice of a guy, right? So, like, he's actually really, really, like, a genocidal madman who's up on the levels of being a terrible, terrible person in, like, history. You have to understand, though, he's later on going to do so poorly at running this colony and is going to lead to so much violence and death against the Taino people that he then tries to rein the colonists back in again by, like, putting one of them on trial and executing a colonist, a Spanish colonist. But then the Spanish crown, Isabel and Ferdinand, are like, you didn't have the right to do that. And literally, he gets arrested. Y'all, Columbus dies back in Spain, poor and kind of in shambles and disrespected. Dies in an upper level of a house that he doesn't even own because literally he wasn't even able to keep control of the colonies that he started, right? He died, like, in shame, thinking that China was, like, right around the corner, right? Like, so, like, now, the thing about it, though, is after Columbus is going to be arrested, and then all of his colonial holdings will go over to the actual kings and queen, or the king and queen of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, what's going to happen there? Well, we need to understand that that is going to be the first wave, right? Columbus is the very first wave of, like, conquistadors, okay? Now, what a conquistador is a name used for a Spanish conqueror, right? Because that is going to be their main prerogative in this story, is they are there to conquer, conquest, and take over. The natives outnumber the Spanish heavily. There are millions of natives to the thousands of conquistadors, but you have to understand that there are two things that Europeans had that's going to dramatically affect their ability to take over native societies easily, right? And the two things that they have are, one, large domesticated animals, and two, forgeable metals. Now, let's talk about how these things played into their advantages, right? The large domesticated animal one is kind of hard to explain, but if you stay with me right here, you'll get it, okay? Now, why is having large domesticated animals like horses, cows, chickens, swine, bovine, and things of the like going to help the Spanish in the conquest of the natives? Some of you are like, oh, well, they can ride them and they have more ample meat production. That is true, but I want you to think thousands of years in the past, okay? There's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book written by this guy named Jared Diamond. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel that really quanders this one, or like, it's like, this is his main question, right? He asked this main question: why was it that the Europeans were so much more advanced than the natives when the natives had been there for almost exactly as long? Well, one of the interesting things he deduces as an evolutionary biologist is that large domesticated animals that had been being bred and farmed in areas in Europe for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is going to create diseases amongst European people, giving them immunity to them because they were exposed to them throughout history. The natives weren't exposed to these diseases at all since they didn't have those large domesticated animals, leaving them open to death. And then also forgeable metals is going to be a big one as well, because as we know, when we talked about ancient Greece, the Europeans went through the Iron Age and the Bronze Age in the eras where they would actually forge different metal weapons, and that's going to give them things like guns, cannons, iron weapons, swords, and things like that. Now, speaking of those diseases from the large domesticated animals that the Europeans had some immunity to, the Europeans carried smallpox, measles, and influenza that would lead to a 90% death rate of the native people because they had no resistance or immunity whatsoever, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, you're going to see also deliberate conquest, right? We're going to talk in class a little bit about how in the Americas, Cortez, okay, Hernan Cortez is his name, is going to lead a massive conquest against the Aztec people in the area of what is now known as modern-day Mexico, okay? Because he lands in Mexico in 1519 with the intent of conquering all and claiming the gold that resides there. But we will talk about that when I see y'all in class. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.